Now let's do a rib review. First, let's talk about the motions that the ribs and the sternum make during respiration. When we look at the sternum, we know that the sternum is broken up into the manubrium, the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. When the ribs come in the anterior portion and create their cartilaginous joints with the costal cartilages, and the costal cartilages of each rib make their synovial joints with the body of the sternum. What happens with the respiration is when you inhale and the diaphragm contracts, extends inferiorly, and the body of the sternum will actually end up coming out, which is said to be like pump handle. As it comes out like this, and the motion of this pump handle will also combine with the motion of the ribs in the bucket handle formation. So as the ribs, as you inspire, air comes into the lungs, diaphragm contracts, these ribs will end up coming out like this, like you would be holding on to the handle of a bucket. Now let's look at some features of the ribs, and then we'll discuss the joints that they make with the vertebra, the transverse process, the costal cartilages, and the sternum itself. First, let's try to distinguish how we're going to tell a right rib from a left rib. The main features for that would be the rounded superior border, the pointed inferior border, and the orientation of the tubercle. I have two ribs in front of you, in which you have this rounded superior border on top, the pointed inferior border, where you're going to find the subcostal groove, and you also have the tubercle on the inferior border. So that's how I know I have a left rib here and a right rib here. Let's discuss quickly the features of the rib. So the rib is broken into the head, the neck, the body, and at this point here you have the angle. The different features of the rib, we have the superior and the inferior demifacets, which are responsible for articulating with the superior and inferior articulating costal facets on the vertebrae. We have the tubercle, which is responsible for articulating with the articulating facet on the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae, and that joint is called the costotransverse joint. The joints that the head of the rib make with the vertebrae are the costovertebral joints. Both the costovertebral joints and the costotransverse joints are synovial. Extending from the tubercle and along the rib, you have the subcostal groove, in which runs the posterior intercostal vein, posterior intercostal artery, and posterior intercostal nerve. And they run in that orientation from superior to inferior, making it the van orientation. The rib itself, as I was saying, makes the costovertebral joint and the costotransverse joint posteriorly, but then anteriorly, it makes the costochondral joint with the costal cartilage of each rib, and that costal cartilage will extend over to the sternum to create the costosternal joint. The costochondral joint is a cartilaginous joint, and where that cartilage will extend over to the sternum, the joint made at the sternum is a synovial joint. Keep in mind, too, when we're talking about the ribs, that we have different types of ribs. We call true, false, and floating. Ribs 1 through 7 are true. 8, 9, and 10 are false because their costal cartilages articulate with the costal cartilage of the rib above it. And then the floating ribs are ribs 11 and 12. Also, what's important is that ribs 1, 11, and 12 articulate only with their own vertebrae. Whereas the other ribs will make their costovertebral joints with their own vertebrae and the vertebrae above. For example, if this is rib number 3, the inferior demifasciate will make a costovertebral joint with the third thoracic vertebrae, and the superior demifasciate will make a costovertebral joint with the second thoracic vertebrae. And that's what I mean by ribs 1, 11, and 12 being a little bit different, because they only articulate with their own vertebrae, whereas the other ribs will articulate with their own vertebrae and the vertebrae above it.